The studio lights blazed down, reflecting off the sleek glass table between them. A massive LED screen in the background flashed the bold title, "Live Exclusive, Barron Trump Speaks Out." The audience, a mix of curious onlookers, political diehards, and media insiders, hummed with anticipation. Some leaned forward, phones at the ready, eager to capture a moment that could set the internet ablaze. Across from him sat Barron Trump, now a striking young man in his early 20s. His posture was composed, hands lightly clasped together. On the table, his expression unreadable. Dressed in a sharp yet understated suit, he exuded a quiet confidence, one that suggested he was aware of the stakes, but not intimidated by them. Opposite him, the host grinned like a predator who had finally lured his prey into the perfect trap. A veteran in the world of political commentary, he was known for his relentless takedowns, particularly of conservative figures. With his signature smirk and piercing gaze, he shifted in his chair, letting the tension build for just a second longer. A red light on the camera blinked. They were live. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host began, voice dripping with amusement, "tonight we have an extraordinary guest. He's the son of the most controversial president in modern history, raised in the shadows of power, privilege, and, let's be honest, scandal." He let that word hang in the air. But unlike the rest of his family, he's been a mystery, silent, almost untouchable. Until now. A pause, a well-timed chuckle. "So, Barron Trump, welcome. You ready for this?" The bait was set, the audience chuckled. Some shifted in their seats, waiting for a reaction, but Barron didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "Ready for what exactly?" he asked, his voice smooth, unhurried. The host's grin widened. This was going to be fun. The interview had begun. The host leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, eyes gleaming with mischief. He adjusted his tie with exaggerated ease, playing to the audience like a seasoned performer. "You know, Barron," he began, flashing his signature smirk, "I have to say it's quite rare to have someone from your, let's call it unique, background sitting across from me." He let the words marinate, waiting for the murmurs of approval from his audience, which arrived right on cue. Barron remained still, his expression unreadable. "After all," the host continued, gesturing, "loosely, you've lived a life most people couldn't even dream of. Private schools, penthouses, security teams, probably never had to wait in line for anything in your life." He let out a low chuckle. "And yet, despite all that, here you are, finally stepping into the spotlight. I have to ask, was this always the plan, or did you just get bored of the golden silence you've been enjoying all these years?" The audience laughed. A few claps scattered through the room. The energy was shifting in the host's favor, and he knew it. He pressed on, "Because let's be real, if your last name weren't Trump, do you honestly think you'd be sitting in that chair right now? Do you think anyone would actually care what you have to say?" A slow murmur rippled through the crowd. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the anticipation, the unspoken expectation that this would be the moment Barron cracked, stumbled, or at the very least, got defensive. But he didn't. Instead, Barron blinked, a small flicker of amusement crossing his face. He tilted his head slightly as if weighing the words before responding, and then nothing. He simply waited. The host's smirk faltered just a little. The audience quieted. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable, not for Barron, but for everyone else. Finally, the young Trump leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table. "That's an interesting question," he said, voice even, unwavering. But before I answer, let me ask you something. If my last name weren't Trump, would you have spent the last 2 minutes trying so hard to discredit me before I've even said a word? The laughter died. The host's smirk froze in place, but his eyes gave him away. He wasn't expecting that. The audience, sensing the shift, murmured in intrigue. Barron hadn't dodged the jab. He'd flipped it right back. And now all eyes were on the host, waiting for his next move. The host chuckled, leaning in slightly, his voice taking on a softer, almost patronizing tone. "Touché," he admitted, nodding as if he were humoring a child who had just said something unexpectedly clever. "But let's not pretend this is some grand gotcha moment, Barron. I mean, come on." He gestured broadly to the studio, to the audience, to the cameras beaming their conversation to millions. "We both know why you're here. It's not because you've fought your way up from the bottom, or because you've had some remarkable struggle that makes your voice one worth hearing. It's because of that last name, because no matter what you do, that name has carried you into rooms most people will never even get to peek into." The audience chuckled, some nodding in agreement. The host saw his opening and took it. "Let's be real," he continued, flashing a smug smile. "People love a good underdog story. But you're not an underdog, Barron. You were born with a silver spoon in your mouth. No, scratch that. Probably a solid gold one, monogrammed with a giant. On the handle." More laughter, louder this time. The host relaxed back into his chair, feeling the momentum shift back in his favor. "And look, I get it," he added, as if he were explaining something to someone too naive to grasp reality. "It must be hard growing up in the Trump empire, constantly in the public eye, having every move analyzed. But hardship? Real struggle?" He scoffed. "You've never had to worry about where your next meal is coming from. You've never had to choose between rent and groceries. You've never had to—" Barron raised a hand, slightly, signaling him to pause. A murmur ran through the audience. The host arched an eyebrow, curious. "Let me stop you right there," Barron said, his voice still calm, but now carrying just the slightest edge. "Because you're right. I haven't had to worry about where my next meal is coming from. I haven't had to choose between rent and groceries. But do you want to know the one thing I've had to deal with my entire life?" The audience held its breath. Barron leaned forward, locking eyes with the host. "People like you," he said, his tone cutting through the room like a blade. The host blinked. The audience stirred. "I get it," Barron continued. "It's easy to sit across from me and act like I've had it so easy, like my last name is some kind of automatic cheat code. But the truth is, that name hasn't just opened doors, it's painted a target. On my back since the day I was born, and people like you," he gestured at the host. "You've been waiting for me to fail. You've been dying for a moment where you could point at me and say, 'See? Just another entitled Trump who can't think for himself.'" The energy in the room shifted. Some of the audience members who had been laughing just moments ago now watched with newfound curiosity. "But here's the part you're not ready for," Barron said, his voice steady, his eyes locked onto the host's. "I'm not going to give you that moment." Silence. The host opened his mouth, but for the first time he hesitated. The game had changed. Barron let the silence settle. He didn't rush to fill it. Instead, he leaned back slightly, taking in the host's smirk, the shifting expressions in the audience, the weight of the moment. The tension was thick, electric. Then with a small nod, he spoke. "You're right," he said simply, his voice smooth, deliberate. "I was born into privilege. I've never had to worry about where my next meal is coming from. I've never had to struggle the way so many people in this country do. That's a fact." The admission caught the host off guard. He had expected defensiveness, excuses, not this. Barron continued, unfazed. But let's talk about what that really means. See, privilege, any privilege, doesn't make someone automatically right or wrong. It doesn't determine intelligence, character, or ability. It just means you start in a different place than others. And what you do with that starting position, that's on you. The murmurs in the audience grew louder. Some nodded, others leaned in, eyes locked on him. I could sit here and pretend I've had it rough. That would be dishonest. But I also won't pretend that having my last name hasn't come with its own set of expectations. And the difference between me and some of the people who sit in this chair is that I actually acknowledge it. The host's smirk twitched, just barely. See, I don't play the victim card, Barron continued, voice unwavering. I don't sit here and blame the system or the media or some invisible force for my circumstances. I take responsibility for myself. And I think that's the conversation we should be having, not about who's had it easier or harder, but about what people choose to do with the life they have. The room shifted. The audience wasn't just watching anymore, they were listening. Barron turned slightly toward the camera now, speaking not just to the host, but to the millions watching. Because here's the truth. Hardship isn't just about money. Struggle isn't just about how much is in your bank account. Some people grow up without privilege and let that become their excuse. Some people grow up with privilege and let that become their entire identity. And neither of those paths lead to leadership or growth. You want to talk about real responsibility? It's about choosing how you think, how you lead, and how you contribute. It's about what you do with what you're given, good or bad. The audience was silent now, hanging on his every word. The host exhaled through his nose, shifting in his seat. Well, he said, clearing his throat. That was quite the speech, Barron smiled. Not cocky, not smug, just assured. Not a speech, he said, just the truth. The host glanced toward the cameras as if recalibrating. This wasn't going the way he had planned. The control of the room had just shifted, and for the first time, it was his name, not Barron's, that was trending online. The host, now visibly frustrated yet determined to regain control, leaned forward again, his fingers tapping lightly on the table in front of him. His eyes narrowed, and the familiar smugness crept back into his expression. Barron's calm composure had clearly thrown him off balance, but he wasn't about to let this slip away. "All right, Barron," the host said, his tone shifting, now colder, more calculating. "You say you take responsibility for yourself, and that's admirable, but let's not kid ourselves. It's easy to sit here and preach about personal responsibility when your family has a history of making controversial, sometimes outright, dangerous statements." He raised a finger as if he were about to unveil the greatest truth. "You've heard your father's remarks, right? About immigrants, about the press, about women." He's called entire groups of people criminals, rats, and, well, fake news. He paused for dramatic effect. "And then, of course, your brother, Eric, has spoken in ways that are, let's say, less than enlightened." The host's eyes twinkled as he delivered the blow. "So tell me, Barron, how do you reconcile the rhetoric you've heard in your household with your claims of personal responsibility? Do you think it's possible to separate yourself from the words and actions of those closest to you, especially when those actions have caused so much harm?" A few gasps echoed through the studio. The audience seemed to hold its collective breath. Barron didn't blink. His expression remained composed, unfazed. He'd expected this. "You're trying to paint me with a broad brush, and I get that," Barron replied, his voice steady, without a hint of anger. "But the reality is, I'm not my father. I'm not my brother. I am my own person. I've grown up in a family with a public voice, yes, and I can't control the things people say, but I can control how I respond to them. And just because someone else says something doesn't mean I'm required to defend it or agree with it. The host's eyes flashed with triumph, clearly thinking he had found an opening. He leaned in further, voice low and dripping with condescension. But you're defending yourself right now, aren't you? By distancing yourself from your family, you're implicitly defending them, aren't you? Because it's impossible to ignore the rhetoric, Barron. It's impossible to say, I'm nothing like them, when the legacy of those very statements is woven into the public narrative you were born into. The audience shifted uncomfortably. It was becoming clear. The host was trying to paint Barron into a corner. He smirked, pleased with the direction he was taking. The trap was set, and the bait had been taken. But Barron, still calm, still calculating, finally met the host's eyes, his gaze unflinching. I'm not defending anyone, Barron said quietly, but with piercing clarity. I'm refusing to accept the idea that I have to explain or justify my family's mistakes every time I speak. He paused. Let the words sink in. I've watched people use the actions of others as a crutch, a way to avoid accountability for themselves. But that's not me. If my father makes a comment I don't agree with, I'm not obligated to apologize for it. And if someone is trying to manipulate me into defending things I can't control, well, I'm not going to fall for that either. The host's confident smirk faltered for just a second. Barron's words were hitting with the force of a reality check. For the first time in the interview, he was on the defensive, unable to rely on his usual tactics. Barron continued, voice unwavering. I don't owe anyone an explanation for the things I haven't said, and I'm done trying to carry the weight of others' words. I have my own voice. You're hearing it now. The silence in the studio was deafening. The audience, unsure of how to react, watched the host's next move carefully. His eyes flicked toward the cameras as if he were considering how to pivot, but for a moment there was no comeback. The power dynamic had shifted once more. The studio fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint rustle of papers on the host's desk. Barron's calm, composed demeanor was starting to have a palpable effect on the room. The smug laughter that had initially greeted the host's opening jabs had died down, replaced by a tense stillness as the audience absorbed Barron's words. At first, a few of the more vocal members of the crowd had laughed at Barron's expense, mocking his upbringing or his political lineage. But now, as Barron answered the host's pointed questions with sharp clarity and a level-headedness that seemed beyond his years, the initial amusement began to fade. The host's smirk was gone. Barron wasn't just holding his ground, he was owning the room, and he hadn't raised his voice once. His measured responses weren't just words, they were a quiet force, cutting through the jabs and questions like a blade through fog. I'm not pretending I haven't benefited from privilege, Barron had said earlier, but I don't need to hide behind it. And I certainly don't need to apologize for it every time someone tries to take me down because of it. The audience, once skeptical and ready to dismiss him as just another entitled figure, began to murmur among themselves. Some nodded. Others seemed to lean in closer, their eyes fixed on Barron as he continued. It wasn't just what Barron was saying, it was how he was saying it. His words were carefully measured, devoid of the defensive posturing typical of anyone in his position. He wasn't just responding to the host, he was making the room think, challenging everyone's preconceived notions. A subtle shift began. What had once been light chuckles and side glances was now a quiet, almost reverential atmosphere. People who had been skeptical of Barron's ability to handle the pressure, perhaps because of his last name, his family's history, were now Watching in stunned silence, the camera zoomed in on one woman in the front row who had initially been among the loudest laughers. Her face now held a mixture of admiration and surprise. Another woman beside her whispered something to her companion, and both nodded in agreement, clearly impressed by Barron's poise. Even the host, despite his practiced charm, was beginning to look a little uncertain. His earlier questions had been designed to corner Barron, to make him stumble, but Barron wasn't biting. The host's previous self-assuredness had started to crack, replaced with a mounting frustration as he realized his usual tactics weren't working. Well, Barron," the host finally said, his tone losing some of its earlier bite. "I have to admit, you're certainly a lot more poised than I expected." Barron simply nodded, his expression still calm, but with a hint of something deeper. Was it frustration? Or was it something else? "People have been expecting me to fail," Barron said slowly, his voice quiet but carrying. "But I'm not here for that. I'm here to have an actual conversation, not a gotcha moment." A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, a few glances exchanged among them. Barron's words had hit home, especially for those who had come in expecting a typical clash, an easy takedown of the Trump family's youngest member. Instead, they were witnessing something completely unexpected. For the first time in the interview, even the host looked as though he might be reconsidering his position. Barron's composure was undeniable now. The laughter from earlier had quieted to whispers, then to silence, and it was now clear the momentum had shifted. Those who had once seen him as a privileged kid in over his head were now starting to recognize him as someone with the strength to stand his ground, with the confidence to handle the pressure without losing himself. It wasn't just the political supporters in the audience that were beginning to respect Barron's calm. Even the more neutral viewers, the ones who had watched the interview purely out of curiosity, were being drawn in by the young man's intelligence and grace under pressure. Barron had done it. He had gone from being the underdog, someone people thought they could ridicule, to a person of substance. And the audience wasn't just seeing it, they were feeling it. The air in the studio had shifted entirely. The host, having pushed Barron to defend himself and his family, was now looking for one final moment to corner him, an emotional reaction, a slip-up. Instead, Barron had remained calm and composed, throwing back each of his questions with quiet but relentless logic. But now something unexpected happened. Barron straightened in his chair, a subtle but clear change in posture. For the first time, his eyes narrowed, and there was a distinct shift in the energy around him. He wasn't just going to let the host have the last word. "You know," Barron said slowly, almost casually, "I've been watching you for a while, and there's something that always seems a little off to me." The host blinked, momentarily thrown. Barron continued, his tone steady but deliberate. "You like to present yourself as someone who stands for truth, someone who holds people accountable, right? But there's something I've noticed in your interviews. The way you selectively edit facts to push a particular narrative." A stunned silence fell over the room. The host's eyes widened, and the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "You've done it with other public figures before, and I'm sure you're hoping to do it with me too. But here's the thing, I'm not interested in playing into your narrative." Barron leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the host. "You've made a career out of twisting words to fit a specific agenda, and I'm not going to let you do it to me." The host's face hardened, a flicker of uncertainty passing through his expression before he forced a tight smile. He leaned back in his chair, clearly taken off guard by Barron's audacity. "Well, Barron," the host said, his voice barely masking his discomfort, I'm not sure what you're implying. Let me make it clear, Barron interrupted, his words cutting through the host's defense. In 2017, you aired an edited segment about my family during the election, where you took comments out of context to make them seem more inflammatory than they were. It was part of a broader campaign to frame my father in a way that was simply not reflective of the truth. And people bought it because you presented it as the undeniable truth. The host's jaw clenched, his calm facade cracking for the first time. The audience, who had been following along with the host's every word, now began to murmur among themselves, some with raised eyebrows, others nodding. Barron didn't stop there. And last year you did the same with some comments from Eric's. Trump about taxes. You omitted key context that would have completely changed the narrative.
I'm not here to accuse you of lying, but I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. The room seemed to freeze. The host's confident smirk had completely vanished. His hand, which had been resting on the desk, tightened into a fist.
He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out for a moment. Barron's words had hit harder than anything he could have anticipated. I don't think you really care about truth, at least not in the way you claim to, Barron added, his voice unwavering. It's about what fits your story, what gets the clicks, the ratings, the drama. For a moment, the host didn't respond at all. His eyes darted around the room, clearly struggling to regain his composure. His usual quick wit, which had served him well in so many interviews, was nowhere to be found. He opened his mouth again, but this time his words faltered. Well, he started, but the words didn't come out as easily as they usually did. Barron had caught him off guard, and it was clear that he didn't know how to react. The shift in the room was immediate. The crowd, which had been divided up to that point, now seemed to be leaning toward Barron. The initial tension between him and the host had shifted into something entirely different, something that resembled the beginning of a reckoning. Barron took a deep breath and sat back, his gaze still fixed on the host. You know, I came here tonight thinking we could have a real conversation. I didn't expect to be grilled with the same tired tactics. But I'm not here to let you twist things or make me into some character I'm not. I'm here to have a real conversation, and that's all I'm asking for. The host, momentarily stunned into silence, finally regained a bit of his composure, but it was obvious that the tables had turned. His earlier smugness was gone, replaced with a frustrated tension that was impossible to hide. For the first time in the interview, he wasn't the one in control. Barron had seized the narrative, and now the host was left scrambling to keep the upper hand. The audience was leaning forward, eyes wide, waiting for the next move. The host swallowed, but the usual sharpness in his voice was gone when he finally spoke. Well, I guess we'll see where this conversation goes next, won't we? The words hung in the air, but no one was buying it anymore. The shift was complete. Barron Trump had just turned the tables, and in doing so he had left the host at a loss for words. Just as the host seemed ready to regroup, the quiet tension in the studio was shattered by a sudden, sharp ding. Everyone's eyes instinctively turned toward the giant screen behind Barron, where the video feed of the interview was being broadcast. On the screen, a small notification appeared. Breaking news, host's past comments surface. And before anyone could fully comprehend what was happening, the clip began to play. It was from years ago, a past interview in which the host had made a strong condemnation of political privilege, an outspoken critique of wealthy political families who used their influence to push narratives. He had boldly stated, "Those born with silver spoons in their mouths will never understand the real struggles of the people. They can't be trusted to represent anyone other than their own interests." The words rang out with unmistakable authority, as if he were trying to convince the world that he was the only one seeing the truth about privilege and inequality. But as the clip continued, the host's current position, so careful and calculated, stood in stark contrast. A now public figure, Barron Trump, was the subject of that very interview, a direct target of the host's old stance. He had gone from condemning the very thing Barron represented to sitting on the same stage with him and treating the privilege narrative as something to be used for ratings. The room's atmosphere shifted in an instant. There was an audible gasp from the audience. A murmur rose, growing louder, as the host's past words collided with the reality of his present actions. The host's face turned pale, a slight tremor in his hand as he reached for the desk to steady himself. He glanced at the screen, watching. His younger self, speaking with such conviction, and for the first time that night, he looked truly uncomfortable. The host stammered, his voice cracking for just a moment. That's an old interview and it's taken out of context, but the damage had already been done. Barron, for the first time since the interview began, smiled, not smugly, but with a quiet sense of triumph. He didn't need to say anything. The clip spoke for itself. And then the social media explosion began. Tweets, posts, and hashtags flooded online platforms faster than anyone could keep track. The clip went viral within minutes, shared by thousands of users. Headlines were posted immediately. Host who attacked Trump, privilege in the past, now embraces it for ratings, hypocrisy exposed in real time, host's own words backfire. Breaking, host's credibility in free fall after past comments resurface. The backlash was immediate and unforgiving. Even some of the host's most loyal supporters, who had once seen him as a champion of truth, began to question his integrity. The comments section of his show's page was flooded with criticism, accusing him of exploiting his position to maintain ratings with no regard for the contradictions in his own stance. In the studio, the host struggled to regain control, his
usual quick wit failing him. "It's important to understand the context of," he started, but Barron interrupted him smoothly. "You're right," Barron said, his voice calm but carrying weight.
The context is that you've spent years pretending to be a defender of truth and justice while manipulating your audience for a better paycheck. It's clear that your stance is only as strong as the next broadcast. The host's attempt to brush it off crumbled in the face of Barron's deliberate dismantling. The audience, who had once been divided, was now leaning in the opposite direction, their earlier skepticism replaced by a growing sense of disbelief, and for some, a sense of respect for Barron's ability to stand tall amid the storm. Outside the studio, the fallout was swift. The host's career was now the subject of intense scrutiny, and it seemed like every major media outlet was already picking apart his past contradictions. The internet had been quick to embrace Barron's pointed critique, and his presence in the conversation, one that had initially seemed like a misstep or a mere sideshow, was now seen in an entirely new light. The host shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and for the first time in the interview, his voice faltered completely. "Well,
I stand by my words, but I also—" "You're not standing at all, actually," Barron said, cutting him off, his voice firm. "You're scrambling, trying to explain away your own hypocrisy." For a moment, the host seemed utterly defeated.
His carefully constructed persona now laid bare in front of millions. He looked at the camera, then back at Barron, but the earlier smugness was gone, replaced by the palpable weight of being exposed. The room was electric now, the energy in the studio unlike anything seen before. As the clip continued to circulate online, it was clear that the power had shifted. Barron Trump had just deconstructed the host's narrative, and in doing so, had completely dismantled his credibility. The host was no longer in control. The interview was no longer his. It was Barron's moment, and the world was watching as he took it. The host's face flushed a deep shade of red, the once icy composure he had prided himself on now unraveling before the cameras. His hands gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white with tension. The clip still hovered on the screen behind. Them, the final nail in his attempt to control the conversation. I didn't come here to be lectured by someone who's spent their entire life being handed everything, the host spat, his voice sharp and his words dripping with frustration. You think you can sit there and pretend like you're some enlightened, self-made person? What about your father's policies? What about your brother's controversial statements? You can't distance yourself from that just because you decided to show up on a talk show and play the perfect poster boy for the enlightened elite. He was throwing everything he had left, everything he had hoped would make Barron crack, make him stumble. His eyes bore into Barron's as if daring him to react, to lose his cool, to give him the ammunition he needed to bring this back under his control. But Barron didn't flinch. The young man was unfazed. His posture remained as solid as a rock, his hands still resting lightly on the table, his eyes fixed on the host with a quiet intensity that only seemed to deepen with every jab. Do you really think you're going to provoke me into defending
"My family?" Barron asked, his tone calm, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that didn't go unnoticed. You want me to react emotionally, to start apologizing for things I can't control?
But that's your narrative, not mine. The host's jaw tightened, and he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This wasn't the easy interview he had hoped for. Barron was no longer just sitting there. He was countering every attack. With precision, every word measured but loaded with intent. You want to talk about privilege? Barron continued, his voice steady, like the calm before a storm. You want to talk about my family's legacy? Let's talk about the privilege you have, sitting here, holding a microphone and a platform, attacking people based on nothing but your own biases. You're the one exploiting narratives for ratings. You're the one trying to pit people against each other, all for clicks. The host flinched at the sting of Barron's words, but his desperation only grew. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with intensity. You think you can just dodge every question? You're not a politician, Barron. You're a privileged kid who's been handed a pass his entire life. You've never had to worry about the things most people face. So what are you really trying to prove here? That you're some kind of intellectual? Barron's lips barely twitched, his expression unwavering. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just not interested in participating in your game. You want me to get emotional, to lose my composure, something to make your audience feel good about their own biases, but I'm not going to give
that to you. That's your tactic, not mine. The host's patience snapped. He slammed his fist on the desk, the sound echoing through the studio. You think you can just sit here and pretend to be above all of this?
He barked. Your family has been at the center of scandals, at the heart of everything that's wrong with this country. Your father, your brother, they've used their positions to attack the very people you pretend to care about. And yet,
here you are, acting like you've got it all figured out. Barron's gaze didn't waver. He was still calm, still grounded, like an immovable force in the storm. He paused for a moment, then spoke, slowly, clearly. You know, I never said I had it all figured out.
But I am figuring it out. And the difference between me and you is that I don't use people's struggles to build a career. I don't exploit anger for ratings, and I'm not about to get caught in your web of hypocrisy. The host's face twisted with frustration, his voice raising another octave. You think you're better than me, don't you? You think because you sit there with your fancy suit and your calm demeanor that somehow makes you morally superior, right? Barron shook his head. I don't think I'm better than you. I think I'm different. And that difference is why I'm not going to give you the emotional spectacle you're craving. The audience was silent now, their eyes flicking between the host's reddening face and Barron's unshaken poise. The air was thick with tension, but Barron was standing his ground, his words ringing true. The host opened his mouth again, but it was as if the words caught in his throat. Barron had turned the tables once more, and now the host was the one left trying to regain control of the situation, only to realize, for the first time that night, that he was losing. Barron's response was clear, powerful, and final. Maybe it's time to stop pretending this is a game, Barron said softly, but every word felt like it carried the weight of his years. Maybe it's time to actually talk about something real. The host was visibly defeated now, unable to respond. And as the seconds ticked by, the realization settled over him like a heavy blanket. He was no longer in control. The moment had shifted, and Barron Trump had just won. Just as the host was recovering from his emotional outbursts, the tension in the studio remained thick. Barron sat still, his composure never wavering, while the host, though visibly flustered, tried to regain his usual sharpness. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with a quiet intensity that crackled like static in the air. The interview had taken a turn no one, including the host, had anticipated. Then, just as the next round of questioning was about to begin, the mood in the room shifted once again. A notification pinged from one of the studio's media feeds, barely audible but enough to catch the attention of a few in the crowd, as well as Barron himself. He glanced briefly at the screen as it flashed the familiar image of a high-profile political figure, Senator Alexis Warner, a prominent progressive voice who had often been vocal in her criticism of the Trump family. The tweet that appeared on the screen sent a ripple of shock through the studio, and, in a few seconds, the entire media landscape would be reeling. Barron Trump is right. The real issue isn't privilege. It's the hypocrisy of the system that pits people against each other for profit. Whether we like it or not, Barron has shown more poise under pressure than some of the so-called champions of the truth. Respect where it's due. Not just his last name, just real leadership. There was a stunned silence as everyone in the room processed the weight of what had just happened. Senator Alexis Warner, a longtime critic of the Trump family and a staunch advocate for social justice, had just publicly endorsed Barron Trump, not only endorsing him, but calling out the very rhetoric the host had been pushing throughout the interview. It was a bold move, one that no one saw coming. The host, whose face had already been flushed with frustration, now appeared even more disoriented. He glanced at the screen, his eyes narrowing at the tweet, as if trying to will it away with sheer force of will. The live broadcast switched to a wider angle, capturing the growing tension in the studio while the audience buzzed with disbelief. The tweet wasn't just a random act of support, it was a direct challenge to the narrative the host had been desperately trying to weave, and it was coming from someone whose opinion carried weight in political circles. The ripple effects would be felt across the media landscape almost immediately. The host tried to recover, his voice cracking slightly as he glanced back at Barron.
I suppose you've got some pretty high-profile friends in your corner, don't you? Senator Warner, always ready to jump on a bandwagon when it suits her. Barron raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Senator Warner
isn't the only one, he said quietly. But if you want to focus on her instead of what's being said, I guess that tells me all I need to know." The host's eyes darted nervously around the room. He could feel the walls closing in. Barron, once perceived as just a privileged young man with little to offer beyond his family name, was now being publicly validated by one of his harshest critics. The endorsement was the kind of moment that could change the course of a narrative, especially when it came from someone like Warner, whose following spanned both conservative and liberal spheres. Before the host could come up with a
retort, Barron spoke again,
his voice steady but filled with undeniable confidence. "I think it's important to understand that support doesn't come from the name you carry. It comes from what you say, how you act, and what you stand for," Barron said, his words cutting through the air. "Senator Warner might have a different political view than mine, but she can still recognize when someone speaks the truth. That's more than I can say about some people on this stage." The host visibly bristled at Barron's jab, but he couldn't bring himself to fire back. The damage had been done. The tweet from Senator Warner wasn't just a political endorsement, it was a validation of Barron's character. It cast a shadow over everything the host had tried to claim about
him.
And in that moment, Barron had just become more than the son of a former president. He was now seen as a voice, one that could cut through the noise, even in the most hostile of environments. The crowd, once divided, now murmured in quiet approval. Some nodded in agreement, others looked to the host for a response, but none came. The energy in the room had shifted once again, and the host's earlier control over the conversation seemed like a distant memory. Barron Trump had done what no one expected. He had turned the tables, not just with logic and composure, but with the unexpected backing of someone who had historically been his harshest critic. The ripple effect had begun, and it would continue long after the cameras stopped rolling. The host sat back, momentarily stunned into silence. His fingers, which had been drumming anxiously on the desk only moments before, were now still. His gaze shifted between Barron and the growing storm of reactions from the audience. He could feel the momentum slipping through his fingers like sand in the wind. His carefully crafted plan to undermine Barron, to make him look weak, entitled, and out of touch was backfiring spectacularly. The very narrative he had sought to create was dissolving before his eyes. The realization hit him in waves. At first, it was subtle, just a feeling of unease as Barron remained unfazed by every jab. But as the minutes ticked by, the full impact became clear. Barron wasn't crumbling under pressure. In fact, he had turned the interview into a stage for himself, one where he had proven to be far more poised and articulate than anyone had expected. The host's own words were no longer carrying weight. They were starting to look shallow, forced, even desperate. Barron hadn't just survived the questions. He had redefined the conversation. The room had gone from skeptical amusement to a mix of admiration and tension. The murmurs of disbelief had shifted into quiet respect. People were starting to see Barron as something more than just another privileged figure. He was being perceived as a thoughtful, well-spoken individual capable of handling adversity without losing himself. The crowd was now leaning in, some nodding at Barron's responses, others exchanging glances of silent acknowledgement. They weren't just passive observers anymore. They were engaged, genuinely paying attention to what Barron had to say. Even those who had been cheering for the host just moments ago seemed to be reconsidering their stance. The audience's energy had palpably shifted in Barron's favor. The host, still reeling, quickly glanced at the screens, his face flushed with frustration. He had tried to bait Barron into reacting emotionally, to expose him as fragile under the weight of his family's history. But Barron had remained a constant, never allowing himself to be cornered. Instead, he had called out the host's hypocrisy, held his ground, and, with the unexpected endorsement from Senator Warner, had effectively turned the interview into a statement of his own character and resilience. The host's usual sharpness was gone, replaced by the sinking feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, Barron was playing the game better than he had. A glance at the teleprompter revealed the growing wave of reactions on social media. The hashtag Jacques Barron Speaks was trending, with users praising his composure and his ability to rise above the theatrics the host had tried to orchestrate. The very thing the host had hoped would be his victory lap, his chance to tear Barron down, was turning into a public relations disaster. The host shifted in his seat, trying to maintain control, but it was clear the room was no longer with
him. He opened his mouth, but the words that came out felt weak, almost like an afterthought. "Well?" the host muttered, his voice lacking its usual bite. "I'm glad we can have an adult conversation about this," the crowd reacted with
uneasy chuckles, some genuinely awkward, others tinged with a sarcastic tone. It was as if they could sense the host's defeat and were waiting for him to admit it. Barron didn't react to the host's weak attempt at regaining composure. He sat there, still calm, still measured, like a young man who had just weathered
a storm and was unbothered by it. "We are having a conversation," Barron said, his voice crisp and clear, cutting through the awkward tension.
But a conversation is only meaningful when it's about something real. Not just about the clickbait, not about exploiting people for drama. We're here to talk about the truth, and that's something worth listening to. The host's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. He could feel the weight of Barron's words, each one digging deeper. The energy in the room was unmistakable now. Barron had not only won the interview, but he had also taken away the control from the host. The host had tried to use Barron's family name against him, only to realize that Barron was no longer defined by it. He had become his own person in the eyes of the audience, someone capable of standing up for himself without the need for theatrics. For the first time, the host truly felt the sting of his failure. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong, it was the public unraveling of his credibility, and Barron Trump had done it without breaking a sweat. The tension in the studio reached a boiling point. The host, once brimming with confidence, was now visibly on the back foot. His carefully constructed narrative had crumbled. Barron, unwavering, had dismantled every attempt to provoke him, every effort to turn the interview into a spectacle. The crowd was no longer just observing, they were invested, hanging on every word Barron spoke. And now, with the room heavy with anticipation, Barron stood poised to deliver his most defining moment of the night. The host, growing desperate, made one final attempt to shift the conversation. "You say you're not like your family, Barron, but we're all products of the environment we grow up in. Your father's rhetoric has shaped this country's political landscape, and you can't just pretend to be immune to it. You can't distance yourself from the division that's tearing us apart." The words hung in the air, thick with accusation. The host's voice rose, laced with a final attempt at attacking Barron's character. But Barron didn't flinch. He looked the host dead in the eye, his expression calm yet determined, like a man who had waited for this moment his entire life. "You're right," Barron began, his voice steady, each word clear and deliberate. "We're all shaped by the environment we grow up in. But what you fail to realize is that we're also capable of making our own choices. I may have grown up in the shadow of political controversy, but that doesn't mean I'm bound by it. I don't believe in using my father's actions as an
Excuse for mine. The audience shifted, a collective tension hanging in the balance.
Barron's gaze never wavered from the host, his voice growing stronger as he continued. Political discourse doesn't have to be driven by hostility and division, Barron said, the power of his words building with each phrase. It doesn't have to be about attacking and dehumanizing the other side. We're living in a time when every disagreement is blown out of proportion, when hate is celebrated and understanding is dismissed. But I refuse to contribute to that. I refuse to be a part of that cycle. The host opened his mouth, but Barron raised a hand, silencing him. You want to talk about responsibility, Barron said, his voice now ringing with authority. True responsibility is about how we treat each other, about respecting the conversation, not using it as a platform to tear others down for the sake of entertainment or ratings. We can disagree, we can debate, but we don't have to destroy each other in the process. That's the kind of discourse I believe in. That's the kind of discourse I want to be a part of. The host was quiet now. He had nothing left to say. Barron's words had hit with the force of a thunderclap, and the weight of their truth was undeniable. The room, which had once been filled with tension and hostility, now felt different, almost charged with a quiet respect. Barron wasn't just defending himself. He was defending the very idea of healthy, respectful political dialogue. For a moment, the studio was silent, the audience stunned by the weight of what had just been said. Barron had not only exposed the host's hypocrisy, but he had also forced him to confront the reality of a deeper issue, the polarization that had gripped the country. The host, visibly rattled, looked down, avoiding Barron's gaze. He knew he had no defense. Barron had taken control of the narrative, had taken control of the entire interview with a few simple but powerful words. The camera zoomed in on Barron's face as he spoke the final words of the evening. This isn't about my family. This is about what we choose to bring to the table. I choose respect, and I choose to lead by example. I hope others do the same. The silence that followed was deafening. The host, for the first time, was speechless. The crowd, who had been split just moments ago, was now collectively silent, mulling over Barron's words. The interview had come full circle, and Barron Trump had just shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. The host sat back in his chair, his face flushed, the weight of Barron's words pressing down on him. For a brief moment he seemed lost, unsure of how to recover from the wreckage of the interview. His hands gripped the edges of the desk, his eyes darting around as if searching for some lifeline, some way to regain the upper hand. He knew the room had shifted. He knew the audience was no longer on his side. Barron had set the tone, and it was clear the young man had not only held his own, he had completely dismantled the narrative the host had hoped to create. But the host, ever the professional, wasn't ready to let go just yet. He needed to regain control, needed to steer the conversation away from the uncomfortable reality Barron had exposed. "All right," the host said, forcing a smile, his voice attempting to regain its usual sharpness. "Enough about that. Let's talk about something else. You've made your point, Barron, but let's move on to something a little less divisive, shall we?" Barron didn't move, didn't react immediately. He simply looked at the host with a quiet intensity, as though waiting to see if the host would take the bait. But there was no anger in Barron's eyes, no frustration, just quiet certainty that the moment had already passed. The host pressed on, attempting to shift the conversation. "Tell me, Barron, you've grown up in the spotlight for most of your life, but you've kept mostly to yourself. What do you think about the state of social media today? With so much attention on influencers and viral moments, how do you see your role in all of that?" It was a calculated move, a safer, more neutral question, something that wouldn't require Barron to challenge the political landscape any further, something that wouldn't force the host into yet another uncomfortable position. But it was too little, too late. The interview's tone had already been set, and no amount of sidestepping could undo what had already been said. Barron leaned forward slightly, his posture still composed, but now exuding a quiet confidence that seemed to echo through the room. Social media today is a reflection of the world we've created, fast, shallow, and driven by conflict. There's a lot of noise out there, but what matters is how you choose to engage with it. I don't want to contribute to that noise. He paused, eyes locking with the hosts for a moment. I'd rather be part of a conversation that's meaningful, not just about getting attention. The host's lips pressed into a thin line. He could feel the room growing colder, the momentum slipping from his grasp with every word Barron spoke. The shift had happened, and there was no turning back. The audience wasn't interested in platitudes anymore. They weren't interested in the safe questions the host was attempting to toss out to recover. They had seen Barron for what he truly was, a composed, thoughtful individual who could handle himself in a public forum, regardless of the circumstances. The host tried once more, his voice a little quieter this time, almost pleading. But, you know the media today, Barron, people thrive on the drama. It's what gets the views, the likes, the clicks. Do you really think you can change that? Barron didn't hesitate. His voice was calm, measured, but firm. I don't think it's about changing it all at once, but I can choose not to be a part of it. I can choose how I engage. I think that's where the real change begins. The host opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out. He knew it was over. The crowd's energy had already shifted. Barron had already proven his point, and with each passing second it became clearer. This wasn't going to be the easy takedown he had imagined. Barron hadn't just held his ground, he had set the terms of the conversation. The host's usual tactics, his attempts to corner, to manipulate, to make Barron stumble, had failed, and the truth had emerged in a way the host could not control. These key studio lights seemed brighter now, the air heavier, with the realization that Barron had emerged victorious. The host's questions were no longer cutting through. The narrative had been set, and the audience had seen enough. Barron had spoken, and in doing so, he had changed the course of the interview. There was no going back. The host sat there, trying to recover, but the damage had already been done. Barron had proven himself, and the power had shifted irrevocably in his favor. It was over, and the host knew it. The final moments of the interview were palpable with tension, as Barron's final words echoed through the room. There was a quiet stillness now, as if everyone in the studio had collectively held their breath. The host, visibly defeated, shuffled his papers in an attempt to regain some semblance of control, but his movements were mechanical, almost absent. He couldn't shake the feeling that Barron had just won, utterly and decisively. It was then, amidst the heavy silence, that something remarkable happened. From the back of the studio, a single hand rose, clapping slowly. The sound, at first a tentative acknowledgement, began to grow louder. More hands joined in, and soon the applause spread like wildfire, filling the space. A few more members of the audience stood, nodding in approval, and before long the applause was resonating across the room, echoing against the walls. The sound was genuine, there was no pretense in it. The audience was no longer divided. They were recognizing Barron for what he had done that night, for how he had composed himself, for the powerful truths he had spoken, and for his ability to stay above the petty bickering the host had had tried to provoke. Some of the applause was accompanied by cheers and murmurs of agreement. A few audience members shouted, "Well said," and "respect," from their seats, as if the air itself had shifted, creating a space where Barron's composure and conviction could finally be celebrated. The host stood there, frozen in a stunned silence, unable to comprehend the situation unfolding before him. His face was a mixture of confusion and frustration, his mind clearly racing to find a way to salvage the situation, but it was far too late. The narrative was already set. He looked around at the crowd, some standing, others clapping, all focused on Barron, and his expression faltered. The realization was inescapable. He had lost control of the interview, and the public had chosen their side. It only took a few seconds for the standing ovation to grow louder, and by the time it reached its peak, the host awkwardly cleared his throat, his voice tight as he tried to wrap up the segment. "Well, that's all the time we have for tonight," he said, his words rushed and devoid of the usual confidence he carried. "Thanks for joining us, Barron. And to our viewers, at home, we'll be back after the break. Stay tuned." But the words felt hollow, as if he were simply trying to get to the finish line before the moment of his defeat fully sank in. The applause continued, some of it from those who were already on their feet. The host's usual charm, the controlled charisma he had built his career on, had all but evaporated. Barron, still standing at his seat, gave a small, dignified nod to the audience. He wasn't basking in the applause, he didn't need to. His posture remained composed, his eyes calm, but there was a quiet confidence in the way he held himself. He wasn't just the son of a former president anymore. He was his own person, now. And tonight, in front of millions, he had earned their respect. As the applause slowly died down, the host, his awkwardness palpable, managed a strained smile. He tried to make eye contact with Barron, but Barron wasn't looking at him anymore. He was already stepping off the stage, the applause still ringing in his ears. And for the first time in the evening, the host was left to confront the reality of what had just transpired. The narrative had shifted, and Barron Trump had claimed the victory. The moment the interview ended, the internet exploded. Within minutes, clips from the segment began circulating across social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and every corner of the web. A flood of reactions, memes, and debates poured in, quickly dominating the online discourse. Barron's words, his poise, his unshaken composure, his powerful challenge to the way political discourse had been hijacked, became the centerpiece of a massive online conversation. On Twitter, the hashtag #BarronSpeaks quickly began trending worldwide. Thousands of users were tweeting about the interview, praising Barron's performance. Who knew Barron Trump had this much class and wisdom? Barron speaks. Respect to Barron Trump for handling that hostile interview like a pro. Not many could have kept their cool like that. Even those who had been quick to dismiss Barron as just another privileged figure, someone who was just living off his last name, were now taking a step back. Some users admitted they had underestimated him. I'll admit it. I doubted Barron Trump, but after tonight, that was impressive. So Barron Trump just proved he's a lot more than just a kid of privilege. Kudos. Memes spread like wildfire. One viral tweet featured an image of Barron sitting calmly with a caption that read, "When you realize the Trump name doesn't define you. Barron speaks. True leadership." Another meme juxtaposed Barron's calm, measured responses with the host's increasingly flustered expression, with the caption, "The face you make when the guy you were trying to tear down defeats you with logic and respect." On Instagram, influencers and political commentators shared clips of Barron's most powerful moments. The video of him saying, I don't think it's about changing it all at once, but I can choose how I engage. I think that's where the
"Real change begins" went viral, shared by everyone from casual viewers to political pundits who were quick to praise Barron's maturity. This is the Barron Trump we needed to see. No theatrics, just clear, rational thought. Amazing. Even
those who typically criticize the Trump family publicly couldn't ignore Barron's remarkable performance. Pundits who had previously written him off as just a product of his upbringing now found themselves re-evaluating their perspective. I've criticized Barron's family for years, but I'll give credit where it's due. He stepped up in that interview. Political commentator Jessica Collins. Barron Trump just proved that leadership isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about thinking before you speak. Analyst Michael Byrne. Across Facebook, long threads of debate emerged, with people weighing in on Barron's place in the public eye and the future of political discourse. Some argued that Barron's performance signaled a new, more thoughtful generation of political figures, while others saw it as a turning point for the Trump family's image. Even Fox News, usually aligned with the conservative side, was discussing the interview in a way they hadn't expected. Several analysts praised Barron's composure and intelligence, comparing him favorably to some of the loudest political voices on both sides. The conversation wasn't just confined to political circles. Everyday people, influencers and celebrities joined the discussion, sharing Barron's words, dissecting the powerful moments of the interview. As the night went on, Barron's name continued to spread across platforms. YouTube clips of the interview surged in views. Reddit threads discussing the interview were filled with thousands of comments, with users expressing astonishment at Barron's ability to handle the pressure and challenge the status quo of political media. Barron Trump showed
us tonight that we don't need to argue to be heard. He listened, he spoke, and he made his point. I'm listening now.
By the next morning, major news outlets, both conservative and liberal, were covering the viral impact of Barron's interview. It was clear that Barron Trump had shifted the conversation in a way no one had expected. He wasn't just the silent son of a controversial figure anymore. He was a public figure in his own right, commanding attention and respect. The narrative had changed, and Barron had proven that he could stand on his own, intellectually and emotionally, without falling into the traps of political theater. As the online conversation continued to build, Barron found himself not only trending, but being praised for his maturity, his ability to communicate complex ideas with clarity, and most importantly, his refusal to be reduced to a simple caricature of his family's legacy. What had started as a hostile interview had ended in a moment of defeat for the host and victory for Barron, one that would be remembered for a long time. As the clips from the interview continued to spread across the internet, it didn't take long for the mainstream media to pick up on what had happened. The next day, news outlets began dissecting the interview in detail, with a particular focus on the host's failed attempt to belittle Barron Trump. CNN, typically critical of the Trump family, ran a segment titled "A Rare Moment of Clarity. Barron Trump shines while host stumbles." The segment praised Barron's calm and articulate responses, while also criticizing the host for his aggressive approach. What was supposed to be a chance to confront Barron Trump with hard-hitting questions ended up becoming an embarrassing display of journalistic failure, the anchor said. The host tried relentlessly to provoke Barron into a reaction, but Barron stood his ground, showing a level of maturity that was far beyond what many expected. The segment included clips from the interview highlighting moments where Barron maintained his composure despite the host's increasingly harsh questions. It also featured commentary from experts on media ethics, with many criticizing the host for going too far in his attempt to make Barron seem inexperienced and out of touch. This interview backfired spectacularly, said media analyst Karen Roberts. The host, known for his sharp-tongued interviews, miscalculated in his approach. Instead of revealing Barron's flaws, he ended up showing the public just how calculated and unfair his tactics were. The New York Times followed suit, publishing a piece titled "Host's Heavy-Handed Approach Fails: How Barron Trump Won the Interview." The article criticized the host for making Barron a target instead of treating him like any other guest. Piece went into detail about how Barron had been unfairly positioned as a figure to be belittled, despite not having the same history of public involvement or controversy as his father. The host misjudged the dynamics of the conversation, attempting to capitalize on Barron's lack of experience in the public eye. What he failed to realize is that Barron Trump, like many young adults, is capable of thinking critically and engaging in conversation with poise, the article read. Instead of an exposing moment, the interview became a turning point in Barron's public image. Even Fox News, typically aligned with conservative viewpoints, found itself caught in the middle of the debate. While the network refrained from directly attacking the host, analysts on the panel acknowledged Barron's unexpected performance. I think the host underestimated Barron. He expected him to fold under pressure, but instead, Barron stood firm and articulated himself in a way that made the host look like the aggressor, said political commentator and former press secretary Tom Reynolds. It's a testament to how the public has evolved. People aren't just buying into the old narratives anymore. They're paying attention to how people handle tough situations. On social media, it was even clearer that the public was beginning to turn on the host. Comment sections of news outlets, blogs, and viral posts were filled with reactions, and many questioned the ethics of the host's approach. A growing number of voices called for accountability for journalists who used tactics of aggression and belittlement instead of engaging in fair and respectful dialogue. I've seen some harsh interviews before, but the way he went after Barron Trump was unnecessary. That wasn't an interview, that was an ambush, one commenter posted on a popular news site. The host was too focused on making Barron look bad, and it ended up making him look bad instead. Another user tweeted, "I don't always agree with Barron's family, but tonight I think we saw a young man who's ready to step out of the shadows. The host miscalculated big time." Meanwhile, some political analysts argued that the host's failure wasn't just about this one interview. It spoke to a broader trend in the media, where a growing number of journalists and public figures were more interested in exposing weaknesses and provoking reactions than engaging in thoughtful discourse. "This interview represents everything that's wrong with modern media," wrote a political blogger in an op-ed. Instead of asking meaningful questions, the host chose to attack, trying to create a moment of conflict. The result was that Barron Trump came across as thoughtful, while the host looked like a man on the edge of losing his credibility. The host's social media accounts, which had previously been flooded with support from loyal followers, began to receive a wave of critical comments. Some followers accused him of being out of touch and unfair in his treatment of Barron. A few long-time viewers expressed disappointment, stating that they had expected a more professional exchange, not a one-sided attack. As the day wore on, the backlash only grew stronger, forcing the host's team to issue a public statement defending his actions. However, the damage was done. The clip of the interview, the host's failed attempts to provoke Barron, had gone viral. His reputation had taken a serious hit, and it was clear that people were rethinking their perceptions of both the host and his show. Barron Trump, once just a figure overshadowed by his family's legacy, had just earned something significant that night: respect. And in doing so, he had inadvertently exposed the shortcomings of the media figure who had tried to tear him down. The public had spoken, and the host's brand of journalism had failed to meet the moment. The aftermath of the interview marked a clear turning point in Barron Trump's public image. What had initially been seen as a routine appearance on a talk show with the potential for Barron to be cast into the familiar role of the privileged, silent son of a controversial family, had instead propelled him into a new light. The interview, which had been expected to undermine him, had instead elevated him to a place of respect. No longer could Barron be dismissed simply as the child of a former president. He was no longer the figure to be ignored or belittled. The interview, and the public reaction to it, had revealed a young man capable of holding his own, one who could engage in meaningful, reasoned discourse even under the most hostile of circumstances. Barron Trump had transformed from an unspoken presence into a political voice in his own right. Across social media, the shift was unmistakable. Hashtags like Barron Speaks and Barron Rising continued to trend long after the interview ended, and the commentary remained overwhelmingly positive. The conversations about Barron were no longer just about his family. They were about him, his thoughts, his views, and his ability to process complex issues with clarity and maturity. People who had been skeptical of him, based on his lineage alone, began to take notice. They could see his composure, his insight, and his natural ability to remain unfazed in the face of an aggressive, manipulative interview. The Washington Post ran a piece titled Barron Trump's Quiet Rebellion: How One Interview Changed His Public Image Forever. The article analyzed how Barron had strategically distanced himself from the shadow of his family's political history, positioning himself as an independent thinker with the ability to navigate public scrutiny and challenge expectations. Barron Trump, once seen only as a member of a political dynasty, has proved he is his own person. His performance on the interview was a revelation, calm, collected, and unwavering under pressure, the article read. The young man who once stayed out of the limelight has now stepped forward with his own voice, one that carries weight and clarity. This newfound respect for Barron wasn't limited to just media outlets. It spread like wildfire through the general public. People who had dismissed him as the quiet child in the background now saw someone with potential. Former critics of his father's administration, who had previously viewed Barron with skepticism, found themselves grudgingly admiring his ability to articulate himself in a way that felt genuine and composed. Barron Trump didn't just speak, he led with
maturity.
For the first time, I see a future leader who can stand apart from his father's shadow, tweeted one prominent political analyst, summing up the sentiment that echoed across the internet. But perhaps the most significant shift was in Barron's
own demeanor. In interviews and public appearances after the broadcast, it was clear that Barron was no longer hiding in the background. He began to speak more openly about his views, sharing more on his social media, engaging with followers,
and even appearing at various events, often speaking about respectful discourse and his belief in independent thought. He had built a small but powerful following, one that recognized his capability as a voice for the future, someone who could stand in stark contrast to the polarized, sensationalized political environment that dominated the media. What had been seen as an isolated incident, a single interview, had now become the defining moment in Barron's public transformation. The New York Times summed it up in their editorial the following week. Barron Trump has stepped out of the shadows of his family and into his own. Whether you agree with him or not, his message is clear. He's here to stay, and he's not going to be defined by others. Public figures who had long criticized the Trump family began to take notice as well. Former political strategist and commentator Alexis Warner, who had endorsed Barron's perspective during the interview, became one of his strongest public allies. "This is just the beginning for Barron Trump," she said in an interview. "The world has only just begun to see the kind of impact he could make." The younger generation of political voices is rising, and Barron is one of the leaders of that shift. Barron's public trajectory took a sharp turn as he was invited to speak at youth leadership events and political forums, where his measured, thoughtful approach was seen as a refreshing contrast to the loud, often divisive voices that had dominated the national conversation. Even those who initially doubted him had to admit he was someone to watch. In the weeks following the interview, Barron continued to speak out on issues like media responsibility, divisive rhetoric, and the importance of civil discourse, growing into a role that seemed almost natural for him. His voice was no longer just the quiet echo of a political family. It was the sound of someone willing to step into the world with his own views and his own message. Barron Trump, the once overlooked son, had officially entered the spotlight, not as a shadow of his father, but as a young leader with a voice that was uniquely his own. The aftermath of Barron Trump's unexpected triumph in the interview was immediate and undeniable. Within hours of the interview airing, the phone lines at his public relations office were ringing off the hook. Major talk show hosts and networks clamored for a chance to book him on their programs, eager to capitalize on the viral success of his appearance. Barron's performance had captured the public's attention in a way few anticipated, and now everyone wanted a piece of the rising star. The requests flooded in, each one more eager than the last. Hosts from CNN, NBC, and MSNBC extended offers, each program eager to have Barron back on air. But it wasn't just the liberal networks. The Fox News channel, whose audience had often leaned conservative, now found themselves scrambling to book Barron as well. The question on everyone's lips was simple: would he appear again? Some hosts saw Barron as a golden opportunity to continue the conversation. They recognized the moment as not just a viral fluke, but as a potential turning point in how the younger generation would engage in political discourse. These hosts saw him as a fresh face, one that didn't fit neatly into the existing political boxes. They wanted to tap into his independence, the very trait that had made his interview so compelling. Others, however, had more challenging motives. These were the hosts who saw Barron's viral moment as a chance to test his political beliefs, to challenge him directly on his family's past actions and the controversies surrounding them. They saw Barron's poised, calm demeanor as the perfect foil for their hard-hitting, confrontational questioning style. They wanted to see if the young man could stand his ground once more, or if he would crack under pressure. Is Barron Trump truly his own person, or is he just another puppet in the family's political legacy? One invitation email from a major cable network boldly read, they promised an unfiltered conversation with Barron, implying a no-holds-barred debate over his family's influence and his own path. In contrast, the Ellen DeGeneres show made a more light-hearted, inviting offer. The producers wanted to sit down with Barron and discuss not just politics, but his life, his future plans, and his perspective on youth leadership. They offered a less combative environment, one designed to show Barron's humanity, free from the political heat of the previous interview. Meanwhile, podcasts, smaller online shows, and even college lecture series extended invitations. There were calls for Barron to speak at universities, to join debates on the future of politics, and even to contribute to articles and opinion pieces. It seemed that everyone wanted a piece of him, and Barron's influence was growing exponentially by the hour. Even those who had criticized him in the past were now urging him to speak again, but with a different approach. He's more than just his name. He's clearly not afraid to stand up for what he believes in. We need to hear more from Barron Trump, said a major liberal pundit, adding to the calls for his return to media circuits. But Barron wasn't just blindly agreeing to every offer. Despite the flood of invitations, he remained cautious and strategic. He had proven his point, and now he had the leverage to decide when and where to speak next. Barron wasn't going to be a media puppet. He wasn't going to be exploited for ratings or challenged simply for sport. He wanted to ensure that any future appearances were grounded in meaningful dialogue, not just spectacle. He took his time, meeting with his team and carefully selecting which invitations he would accept. He chose the shows that aligned with his desire to continue a civil conversation, focusing on thoughtful exchanges rather than cheap confrontation. Barron's image as a leader wasn't just about handling the pressure of aggressive interviews, it was about taking control of his narrative, and so the invitations kept coming. Some of the biggest names in talk show history were lining up for their chance to have Barron in their studios. Yet Barron remained selective, aware that this moment was bigger than just one more viral appearance. It was a turning point in how he would shape his role as a public figure. Ultimately, Barron agreed to sit down with several shows, but only on his terms. The media's approach had to match his ideals: respectful discourse, open dialogue, and a platform for sharing his vision for the future. In the days following, as interviews and appearances were announced, Barron's reputation
only continued to grow.
The young man who had once been considered an afterthought in the political sphere was now in high demand, not because of who his family was, but because of who he had proven himself to be: a thoughtful, independent individual, capable of leading with intelligence and integrity. In the aftermath of the viral interview, the Liberal TV host found himself in a public relations crisis. The once coveted media darling, known for his hard-hitting questions and confrontational style, was now facing an undeniable backlash. The interview that was meant to expose Barron Trump's supposed privilege and inexperience had backfired in spectacular fashion. As Barron's image soared, the host's reputation began to crumble. Realizing the damage to his credibility, the host issued a public statement, attempting to deflect responsibility and downplay the impact of the interview. His team quickly circulated the statement across social media, hoping to regain some control over the situation. The statement read, "Last night's interview with Barron Trump was intended to give him a platform to express his views in an open and respectful manner. As a journalist, my goal has always been to engage with guests from all walks of life and provide them the opportunity to speak directly to the public. The nature of the discussion naturally led to challenging questions, as is the case with any high-profile figure. I believe the interview served its purpose, allowing Barron the chance to articulate his perspective and for our audience to hear from him firsthand. I stand by the integrity of the conversation." On the surface, the statement seemed like a calculated attempt to reframe the narrative. The host implied that his intentions had been purely journalistic, claiming that the interview had simply been about allowing Barron to express his own views. However, the tone of the interview, the hostile questions, and the increasingly aggressive line of questioning contradicted this claim. The public, especially those who had watched the interview unfold, saw through the host's attempt to downplay the situation. Social media exploded with criticism in response to the statement, with many calling out the host for trying to rewrite the narrative. It's funny how now he's claiming to be all about integrity, but just last night he was attacking a young man who handled himself with more class than the host could ever dream of. "Nice try though," one user tweeted. "The statement's too little too late. Everyone saw what happened on TV. This wasn't about giving Barron a platform, it was about making him a target," said another. The media, including outlets that had once been sympathetic to the host, began to distance themselves from him. Political commentators and journalists alike were quick to point out the glaring inconsistency between the host's actions during the interview and his claims in the statement. If the goal was truly to give Barron Trump a chance to express himself, why was the interview framed in such a confrontational and one-sided manner, questioned a leading media ethics expert in a televised interview. The fact is, the host saw Barron as easy prey, and when Barron didn't bite, it made the host look bad. In a further blow to the host's reputation, several of the talk show's sponsors expressed concern over the fallout. Some companies announced that they were re-evaluating their partnerships with the show, wary of the public relations risk that had resulted from the interview. The damage to the host's image was becoming impossible to ignore. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted as the show's producers scrambled to mitigate the fallout. Calls for apologies and clarification were made, but the damage was already done. The interview had exposed the host as a media figure more interested in spectacle than in meaningful discourse. Meanwhile, Barron's performance continued to be praised. Public figures across the political spectrum, including some who had been critical of his father's administration, rallied around him. They commended his ability to maintain poise and dignity despite being cornered by a host who had clearly intended to provoke him. It's clear now that Barron Trump is not just another privileged child. He's a young man who has thought deeply about the world around him, and he handled that interview with more integrity than the man questioning him, said a prominent journalist in a piece on the growing momentum of Barron's public persona. As the media buzzed with reactions, it became clear that the host's attempt at damage control had only fueled the public's perception of him as a figure who had misused his position to tear down a young man who was simply trying to speak his truth. The host had underestimated Barron, and in doing so had exposed his own shortcomings. Barron, meanwhile, continued to rise, his steady composure and thoughtful words resonating with an audience that was now looking at him in a completely new light. The interview had been a moment of reckoning for both Barron and the host, but Barron's victory was already clear. He had come out of this moment not just unscathed, but with a voice that was impossible to ignore. As the media storm continued to swirl around the aftermath of his groundbreaking interview, Barron Trump took a calm, deliberate approach to his next move. He had already proven his ability to handle the pressure, but now it was time for him to make his next statement, one that would demonstrate his maturity, his ability to remain focused, and most importantly, his commitment to constructive dialogue. Rather than leaning into the chaos or gloating over his viral success, Barron issued a public statement through his official channels, and the tone was measured, humble, and strategic. The statement read, "I want to thank the host and his team for the opportunity to appear on their program. I appreciate the chance to speak directly to the public and share my perspective. I believe that meaningful conversation is built on understanding and respect, and while we may have had our differences in the discussion, I hope that it was a moment that opened the door for further dialogue." He continued, "In today's climate, it's easy to get caught up in sound bites and division. But I believe the future of political discourse needs to be built on empathy, thoughtfulness, and the ability to listen. I look forward to engaging in more conversations that encourage us to see beyond our differences and focus on what we can agree on." The statement was professional, poised, and incredibly well crafted. Barron wasn't playing into the media circus that had surrounded him. He was focusing on the bigger picture, reinforcing his identity as a thoughtful and strategic communicator, someone who wasn't simply reacting, but actively shaping how he would be perceived in the future. The message was clear. Barron wasn't going to let others define his narrative. He was going to define it himself, and in doing so, he was positioning himself as a voice for constructive political engagement. The public response to his statement was overwhelmingly positive. Many applauded Barron for his maturity and his level-headed approach, noting that he had once again demonstrated the qualities that had endeared him to so many. Rather than stepping into the fray of the media wars or responding with defensiveness, Barron was focusing on what he could contribute to the conversation. In contrast, The host's attempt to downplay the situation had only fueled the fire of criticism surrounding his actions, making Barron's statement seem even more grounded
and thoughtful.
Barron Trump's response is exactly what this country needs more of, someone who can remain calm, humble, and forward-thinking despite the chaos around them, said political analyst Sarah Jennings in a tweet that quickly garnered thousands of likes and retweets. While others are focused on the drama, Barron is focused on the conversation. This is a moment of real leadership. In the weeks following the statement, Barron's reputation continued to solidify as a strategic figure in the public eye. Media. Outlets that had been skeptical of him began to reevaluate their stance. Even those who had initially dismissed his performance as a fluke started to acknowledge the consistency and thoughtfulness of his approach. Barron had not only survived the interview, he had used it to his advantage. By choosing to remain composed, by emphasizing the importance of meaningful conversation, and by deflecting any personal glory in favor of a broader message, Barron had positioned himself as a force in the conversation about the future of political discourse. He wasn't just the son of a former president anymore. He was carving out a space where his voice would be heard on its own merits. Barron Trump's next step was clear. He was stepping into the public stage as a poised, independent voice, and he was ready to keep the conversation going. As the media continued to buzz over Barron Trump's remarkable performance in the interview, a new wave of political speculation began to take root. Analysts, pundits, and political insiders who had once dismissed Barron as just another figure in the background of his family's legacy were now seriously considering his potential role in the future of American politics. His calm, strategic handling of the intense interview had positioned him in a way that no one had expected. The first signs of this shift appeared in the political commentary segments of major networks. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News all devoted airtime to discussing Barron's performance and what it meant for his future. Political analysts began to debate whether Barron's articulate, poised demeanor marked the beginning of a new chapter in his public life. Let's not forget, this interview wasn't just a television appearance, it was an unofficial introduction to the political stage, said prominent political analyst David Martinez on CNN. Barron Trump wasn't just defending himself, he was defending ideas. The way he spoke about empathy and the future of political discourse was something you'd expect from a seasoned politician, not a young man barely out of his teens. Some analysts argued that Barron's performance had shown a level of political maturity beyond his years. This is a man who, despite being just 23 years old, has already learned how to control the narrative, how to take responsibility for his words, and how to engage with people who may not share his views. That's exactly what we need more of in politics, said Jessica Collins, a political commentator for MSNBC. While some analysts were enthusiastic about Barron's future, others expressed caution, noting the difficult path ahead for anyone with ties to the Trump family. The truth is, Barron will face significant challenges if he ever decides to enter politics. His father's legacy, no matter how much Barron tries to separate himself from it, will hang over him, said political strategist Richard Thompson on Fox News. That said, the way Barron handled the interview shows that he has the potential to chart his own course if he chooses to. He's certainly no longer just a background figure. The growing speculation about Barron's political future extended beyond the immediate media reaction. News outlets began to draw comparisons between him and other political figures who had started their careers at a young age. Some pointed to figures like John F. Kennedy Jr., whose family legacy and public image had once made him a figure of fascination in American politics. Barron's ability to remain poised and thoughtful in a time of extreme polarization made him seem like a potentially appealing figure for a future political movement. Barron Trump could be the figurehead of a new wave of younger politicians. who emphasize civility over rhetoric, cooperation over division, said Jonathan Harris, a political columnist for the New York Times. It's clear that his performance on that show was not just an act of defense, it was the beginning of a recalibration of how he's seen in the political landscape. Social media users added fuel to the speculation, with many discussing Barron's potential as a future presidential candidate. Hashtags like Barron 2028 and Barron for President began to trend, with people suggesting that his public image could be the perfect antidote to the highly polarized, divisive state of politics today. If Barron Trump were to enter politics, he would be the calm, rational alternative to the noise we have now. No more shouting matches, just a thoughtful, measured approach, one user tweeted. On the other hand, some conservative figures started to champion the idea of Barron leading a new, more moderate version of the Republican Party. His ability to speak without the usual political theatrics had made him a potential beacon for those who were frustrated with the current state of American politics, regardless of party affiliation. Barron Trump could represent a new kind of leadership, a version of the Republican Party that moves beyond the extremes and focuses on the kind of unity and change the country needs, said conservative strategist Karen Fields. He'd have a huge following among those who are tired of the noise and want someone who can speak thoughtfully and without rancor. While the idea of Barron entering politics was still speculative, it was clear that the narrative had shifted. Barron was no longer just a side character in the story of the Trump family. He had become a public figure in his own right, someone with his own voice and his own perspective. As the speculation continued to grow, political pundits began to ask, could Barron Trump be the future of American politics? While the young man had not made any public statements about running for office, the interest in him was undeniable. The interview had marked the beginning of a potential political career, and even if Barron didn't pursue it immediately, the idea of him as a leader in his own right was now firmly planted in the public consciousness. The future, it seemed, was wide open for Barron Trump. As the media buzzed over Barron Trump's standout interview performance, it was only a matter of time before his father, President Donald Trump, weighed in on the moment. The Trump family's brand had always been associated with boldness, brashness, and a certain larger-than-life persona, especially from the former president himself. But Barron's calm, measured approach in the face of an aggressive interview had sparked speculation. Was Barron signaling a shift in the Trump family legacy? Was his demeanor a stark contrast to his father's more combative style? On the morning following the interview, Donald Trump took to social media, posting a short but pointed message to his millions of followers. Barron did a tremendous job in his interview last night. Very proud of him. He handled himself with incredible poise and intelligence. Some people talk, others act. Barron is one of the good ones, and he's just getting started. Great things ahead for him. The post, typical of Trump's straightforward style, immediately sent shockwaves.
Through the media.
To many, it seemed like a moment of genuine pride, but some also couldn't help but notice the subtle differences between Barron's manner and his father's usual tone. Barron had been composed, careful with his words, and focused on high-level political discourse. Donald Trump, on the other hand, had built his political brand on outrage, outright confrontations, and bombastic rhetoric. For many, Barron's demeanor during the interview represented something distinctly different from his father's approach. "It's clear that Barron has a style all his own," said political analyst Sarah Martinez. While his father often thrives on sharp attacks and polarizing statements, Barron's response is more diplomatic, more focused on understanding and dialogue. There's a generational shift happening here, and it's something the public is taking notice of. On social media, some commentators took the opportunity to point out the contrast between Barron's measured, calm approach and Donald Trump's typically defiant, combative, political persona. Barron's approach to that interview was an entirely different tone than what we've seen from his father. It's refreshing and surprisingly thoughtful, one political observer tweeted. If Barron enters politics, he could become the antithesis to his father's approach, and maybe that's exactly what the country needs. Others speculated that the tweet from Donald Trump was his subtle endorsement of Barron's approach. One, that wasn't about playing into the polarized political environment, but rather about thinking critically and speaking with substance. Donald Trump seems genuinely proud of Barron, and it's interesting to see how Barron's style seems to differ from his father's more traditional, combative nature, noted a political commentator for the Washington Post. Barron may very well chart a course that differs from the bombastic, conflict-driven rhetoric we associate with his father's political legacy, but not all reactions were entirely positive. Some critics of the Trump family suggested that Barron's calm, introspective approach could be seen as an attempt to distance himself from his father's style in order to reshape his own identity. In the public eye, Barron may have outshone his father in that interview, but let's not forget who raised him, wrote one critic in a viral tweet. If Barron truly wants to define his own legacy, he'll need to break away from the Trump family's shadow entirely, not just in style, but in substance. Despite the speculation, Donald Trump's public reaction was clearly supportive. He was proud of his son, no question about it, and the social media post reflected that pride. But his tweet also raised more questions about the future of the Trump family's political influence and what role Barron might play moving forward. For Barron, his father's tweet represented validation, not only for his composure and performance, but for his individuality as a figure who was carving out his own path. The young man wasn't simply a figurehead for his family's legacy. He was becoming someone with a voice all his own, capable of engaging in thoughtful discourse on a national stage. The question that lingered in the air, however, was whether Barron would continue to follow his father's political journey, or if he would choose to forge an entirely new path, one that would distinguish him as a leader who was less about spectacle and more about substance. For now, all eyes were on Barron, and his father's public support seemed to signal that this was just the beginning of something larger, something that could shape the future of American politics, whether Barron ever formally entered it or not. The growing media attention surrounding Barron Trump's recent interview reached a new peak when a prestigious university think tank, known for its focus on political discourse and media ethics, extended an unexpected and high-profile invitation for Barron to speak at their upcoming conference. The Wilson Institute for Political Discourse, a renowned think tank dedicated to fostering civil debate and discussion around political dialogue and media responsibility, sent Barron an official letter inviting him to participate in a panel discussion titled Rebuilding the Political Dialogue, a New Generation's Approach. The letter, which quickly made headlines, read, "Dear Barron Trump, we have been following your recent interview and the powerful, measured approach you took in addressing the current state of political discourse and media. Your ability to handle such a high-stakes conversation with poise while challenging conventional thinking has not gone unnoticed. The Wilson Institute believes that your perspective as a young voice in today's political climate would provide invaluable insights into the future of political engagement and media responsibility. We would be honored to invite you to join us for our upcoming conference on date, where we will be discussing the role of new generations in shaping more responsible political conversations. We look forward to your response and hope you will consider joining us in this important dialogue." The news of the invitation quickly spread across social media and news outlets, further elevating Barron's already growing reputation as a thoughtful communicator and potential leader. The offer to speak at such a prestigious institution signified a dramatic shift in how Barron was being perceived, both as an individual and as a potential force in future political conversations. No longer just the son of a former president, Barron was now seen as a leader in his own right, someone capable of engaging in meaningful discourse on media responsibility and civic dialogue. "This is a significant development," said political analyst Jennifer Morgan. "The fact that a major think tank like the Wilson Institute wants to engage Barron in this conversation speaks volumes about how his recent performance has shifted the conversation about his future role in public life." For Barron, the invitation was more than just a public relations opportunity. It was a clear signal that the public and now influential institutions were starting to take him seriously. As political analysts began to debate the significance of this invitation, some speculated that this could mark the beginning of a new phase for Barron, one where he could become a central figure in the future of American political discourse, particularly around issues of media ethics and civil conversation. It's clear that Barron isn't just a passive participant in his family's legacy, said Brian Matthews, a political strategist. He's positioning himself as someone who can lead a new conversation, one that transcends partisan divides and focuses on how we communicate as a society. If he accepts this invitation, it's a huge step toward establishing himself as a key voice in the future of political thought. The invitation to speak at the Wilson Institute also drew comparisons to young political figures who had used platforms like this to launch their own careers. Figures such as John F. Kennedy Jr. and Bobby Kennedy had started with public speaking engagements and small political forums before becoming household names. Barron's invitation seemed to hint at the possibility of his involvement in shaping a new political era, one characterized by civility, respect, and collaboration, values that had been sorely lacking in the bitterly divided political climate of the time. On social media, reactions to the invitation were overwhelmingly positive. Many fans, including younger people disillusioned with traditional politics, expressed excitement at the prospect of Barron bringing fresh ideas to the conversation. This is exactly the kind of leadership we need in politics today. Someone who knows how to listen and engage respectfully, one user tweeted. Barron Trump speaking at a think tank? Yes, please. The future is his if he chooses to step into it. Even those who had been critical of the Trump family saw this as an opportunity for Barron to define himself separately from his father's more controversial legacy. I've criticized his family, but Barron's approach to political dialogue is something we need more of in this country, said a political blogger. His invitation to speak at such a respected institution only adds to the idea that he could be the voice of the future, someone who can bridge divides and tackle the hard questions without resorting to drama. While Barron had not yet confirmed whether he would accept the invitation, the offer itself was a clear turning point, one that continued to push the narrative of Barron as a serious, independent thinker in the realm of political thought. Now the conversation around Barron was no longer about his family. It was about his potential to shape how we talk about politics, how we approach issues like media accountability, and how we can move beyond the polarizing rhetoric that often dominates today's discourse. The invitation to speak at the Wilson Institute was more than just a one-time opportunity. It was a significant step forward in Barron's growing role as a voice for the future of political conversation. As Barron Trump's public image soared following his viral interview, the cultural divide surrounding his performance became more apparent than ever. Supporters hailed him as a fresh, thoughtful voice in the midst of a political landscape dominated by division and spectacle. Meanwhile, critics who had long opposed his family's influence in politics seized the opportunity to attempt to discredit him, viewing his newfound prominence as yet another example of the Trump family legacy thriving despite widespread criticism. On social media, the conversation quickly became polarized. Hashtags like Chuck Barron for Change and Barron Speaks trended, with many praising Barron's calm, respectful demeanor during the interview. Supporters pointed to his ability to engage in a civil discourse without resorting to rhetoric or anger, a trait they saw as sorely lacking in the current state of politics. Finally, a young person who can speak with reason, not just emotion. Barron is what the country needs. New generation, Ajtuas Barron speaks, one tweet read. Others noted how Barron had transcended the expectations placed on him due to his last name. Some even began to speculate about his future in politics, suggesting that Barron could one day bridge the gap between increasingly polarized political factions. Barron Trump could be the future leader we've all been waiting for. Someone who leads with intellect and patience, not with childish name-calling and conflict. This interview was just the beginning. Barron 2028, another user posted. But critics, especially those who had long been wary of the Trump family, dismissed Barron's newfound respectability as little more than a calculated public relations move. They argued that despite his calm demeanor, Barron was still tied to the Trump family's controversial past, and any effort to cast him as independent was nothing but a carefully constructed narrative. The fact that Barron can talk about civility and still have a seat at the Trump family table is the height of hypocrisy. This isn't a new voice, it's the same political dynasty, just with a polished exterior, one Twitter user commented. Many opponents also questioned Barron's ability to truly change the direction of political discourse, accusing him of hiding behind a well-spoken facade without addressing the real issues facing the country. Some critics on talk shows argued that Barron's performance was merely a show of finesse, lacking the substance needed to enact meaningful change in the political sphere. Barron Trump can speak eloquently, but let's not forget his family's history. He's not above the mess his father created in politics, said a liberal commentator during a heated segment on MSNBC. This calm approach isn't enough to distract from the fact that Barron comes from a family that has been at the heart of so much division. This isn't leadership, it's just a new coat of paint on the same old politics. The divide didn't just extend to social media and public commentary, it also made its way into talk shows. On one hand, conservative-leaning hosts lauded Barron for his maturity and his ability to rise above the hostility often seen in American politics today. They viewed his performance as a potential turning point, where a new generation could lead with more civility and understanding. Barron Trump handled himself better than most seasoned politicians. That's the kind of leadership we need in America, said a host on Fox News. On the other hand, liberal networks pushed back, maintaining that Barron's composure wasn't enough to distance him from the Trump family legacy of division. They argued that while Barron might be articulate, the very act of giving him a platform without fully addressing his father's policies was, in essence, a form of media manipulation. The truth is, Barron's ability to stay calm doesn't make him a political savior. He still represents the very system of privilege and polarization that has taken hold of this country, argued one liberal talk show host. Despite the divergent views, one thing became clear. Barron's public presence had become a flashpoint for debate. Some saw him as a potential leader who could bring change to American politics by embracing reason and restraint, while others saw him as a figurehead who would only perpetuate the same issues of power and privilege that his family had long embodied. In the wake of the interview, the conversation continued to rage on social media, in public debates, and on political talk shows. The conversation about Barron Trump wasn't just about him anymore, it had become a debate about the future of American politics itself. Would it be defined by hostility and division, or could it evolve into a space where civility and respectful dialogue could thrive? Barron's appearance had sparked that very question, forcing the public to reevaluate what political discourse could and should look like. For Barron, the growing division was only proof of the impact his words had made. Whether you loved him or hated him, no one could ignore the conversation he had sparked. With his newfound attention, Barron Trump now stood at a pivotal crossroads, faced with the question of what to do next. The viral interview had catapulted him into the spotlight, exposing his thoughtful, measured approach to political discourse and sparking widespread debates about his future. The public and media were eager to see if Barron would choose to continue engaging with the public and possibly carve out his own path in the world of politics, or if he would retreat into privacy, maintaining the more subdued, private existence he had previously known. The options before him were both alluring and daunting. On one hand, he had the opportunity to continue building on the momentum generated by his viral moment. Many saw his performance as the beginning of something significant, a potential shift in political dialogue that could transcend the often toxic rhetoric that had come to define modern politics. Barron had the chance to shape his narrative, to speak on the issues that mattered to him, and even potentially run for office one day. His thoughtful, composed responses had won him admiration from both sides of the political spectrum, and with each new invitation to speak or appear on panels, Barron's influence seemed to grow. Political analysts were already speculating about his future. Some suggested that Barron's measured approach might allow him to break away from the extremism and conflict that had come to define his family's political legacy. "This could be a new beginning," said one political strategist. "Barron has the chance to be his own person. He could be the calm in the storm of modern American politics." However, the other side of the equation was just as compelling. Barron had long stayed out of the public eye, rarely participating in the media circus that surrounded his father's presidency. In the face of his family's well-known legacy and the constant scrutiny that came with it, Barron had chosen tight, quieter existence. The idea of continuing down that road, remaining private, untouched by the media firestorm, was equally appealing. Retreating from the public spotlight would allow Barron to maintain a life of personal privacy and independence,
free from the judgment and the public pressure that accompanied the spotlight.
His family's history meant that any move he made would be watched carefully, analyzed and critiqued, whether or not he actively sought political power. Some, especially those close to him, speculated that Barron might decide to stay out of the public eye altogether, instead focusing on his own future, whether it be in business, academia, or another field entirely. Even his father's reaction added complexity to the situation. Donald Trump, ever the public figure, had celebrated Barron's performance with pride, but it was unclear whether he would push his son toward a more active political role or let Barron make his own decision. "I'm very proud of Barron. Great things ahead for him," the former president had said. But was that genuine support for Barron's independence, or was it a subtle nudge toward embracing the political spotlight? That too remained unclear. The decision Barron faced was not just about whether to enter politics or continue his education, it was about how he wanted to define himself. The world had seen him as a thoughtful, articulate individual who could engage in high-level political discourse without resorting to the chaos that often defined his family's legacy. But would that be enough to propel him into a future of public service? Or was this simply a moment, a fleeting spotlight that Barron would choose to walk away from, returning to the quieter life he had led before? What was clear, however, was that Barron's response to this moment, whether he chose to stay engaged in the public arena or retreat from it, would change everything. He had already reshaped the narrative surrounding him, from being just the son of a former president to a young man with a voice capable of sparking national conversations about civility, responsibility, and the future of political discourse. The attention was now on Barron, and the world was waiting to see which path he would choose. Would he embrace the spotlight, continuing to build on the foundation he had laid, or would he step back and let the moment pass, choosing to live without the glare of public attention? The answer was unknown, but whatever he chose, one thing was for sure: Barron Trump had already made his mark. The way forward, whether it be in politics or elsewhere, would be shaped by how he chose to navigate this moment in his life.